styled animation in Photoshop. We'll begin this process by navigating to the Frame Animation Timeline panel. Next, we'll begin to visualize our character's animation by drawing simple line gesture forms for the key storytelling poses. From here, we'll continue drawing simple forms to flesh out the overall movement and action of our animation by working in breakdowns and in-betweens. Following this, we'll spend some time applying volume and form over our line gesture poses to establish our character with more visual clarity and movement. Along the way, we'll learn how we can manage the relationship between the Layers panel and the Frame Animation Timeline panel so that our animation workflow stays organized. After becoming familiar with this layered method and its techniques, you'll be able to work on your own Photoshop Frame Animation projects with more confidence while having fun. So with that, we'll get started in our next lesson. In this lesson, we'll begin blocking in our animation by sketching the key storytelling poses. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so we're going to be using Photoshop to basically create some traditional styled animation, basically where we draw frame by frame. And you can do this in Photoshop by using the Frame Animation Timeline. Now, we already have a course in our library titled Animation and Video Editing in Photoshop. So if you're completely unfamiliar with the timeline and all the different things that you can do, you may want to kind of check out that course first and just kind of see some of the different features that are available in the timeline. Basically though, once you've got your canvas set up the way you want, you can go to Window, here at the top of your Photoshop interface, and then you want to navigate down to where it says Timeline and make sure that that gets checkmarked. So once you have done this, you'll see the timeline down here at the bottom of our interface. And right here in the center, you can see where it says Create Frame Animation. Now you can click on this little arrow pointing downwards, and you have the option to choose either Create Frame Animation, basically where what we're going to be doing, where we're going to draw frame by frame, or you can choose Create Video Timeline, where if you're working with different video clips, you could work in that particular timeline. So we want to go ahead and click on Create Frame Animation right here. And this is what they're going to look like, these little square boxes right here. These are going to be our frames. So the first thing that we can do is, now that we've got our frame timeline down here set up, we can come over here to our Layers panel, and you can see right now we just have the default background layer. So what I want to go ahead and do is create a new layer. And so in this lesson, we're going to be creating the key storytelling poses for our animation. And so the animation that I had in mind was going to be of a kind of a slightly cartoony female character talking on the phone or listening on the phone. And she'll be kind of moving around and making some gestures. So with that said, and again we're making the key storytelling poses, I'm going to go ahead and title this first layer K. So we're going to be just focusing on those key poses, so I want to have just different layers, each titled K, and I'm going to be color coding my layers, whether they're key drawings, breakdowns, or in-betweens, or anything else. We can do this by right-clicking and going down here to the bottom and choosing the color. I'm just going to go ahead and go with red. You'll find later on that this kind of allows you to stay organized, or at least it does for me. Alright, so on our first frame, I'm going to go ahead and grab my brush tool, and let's go ahead and use something like a blue to sketch with. So again, we're going to be kind of drawing a female character here, and I'm not going to be worried about details or anything like that at all. Right now, all I want to focus on is just getting down the poses. And so I'm going to keep everything very minimalistic. So I'm just kind of starting with the head. I'm going to kind of drop a line down here through the center, and then one right here going horizontal. That's basically where I'm thinking about my eyes, where they're going to be, and I may want to put a little circle right here for the nose. So I can use this circle for the nose to kind of track just kind of the overall flow of the head. I'm kind of imagining her whipping her hair around, maybe moving her head around. So that'll be very helpful. And now I want to kind of continue on, just kind of thinking about the spine. Just this line right here going all the way through the character. And again, we're keeping this very minimal. We're not worried about details. And the next thing I want to kind of focus on is the shoulder line. And this is another area that I can kind of track it and kind of use it to think about the overall movement of the character. And I'll kind of put a little circle right there on each end. That's kind of where I would start to block in the shoulders later on when I'm adding more volume and just detail. And then I'll kind of come down here and bring another line for the upper arm. And again, I like to kind of use these little circles right here just to kind of make note of where joints are. We'll bring the forearm up, and just the same principle for the fingers, just keeping them all very minimalistic, just lines basically. So we're just kind of drawing a stick figure, real simple. And for the ends of these fingers, I may want to also put little circles for the fingertips. Again, this kind of provides me with a guide to kind of pull from later on when I kind of draw additional lines to meet up with those circles to fill in volume for this character. And I may want to kind of extend this down just a little bit more right here. Felt like that upper arm is a little bit short. And so I want her other arm over here. This would be her left arm. So this arm on the screen right, if you will. I'm going to kind of have it out like this, kind of like she's kind of talking with her other hand. A lot of people tend to talk with their hands sometimes, and so this will kind of add to the personality of the animation. Okay, so this is basically my first key storytelling pose. And so we could just look at this, and we understand that it's a figure of sorts, even though it's very simple. And we can look at this and probably gather that this figure is talking on the phone, okay? And so we're going to keep all of our key poses, all of our breakdowns, all of our in-betweens like this before we get into adding any kind of volume. So what I want to do now is create another layer. Okay, so I'm going to come over here to my layers panel, and I want to click on this button again right here. This will create another layer, and I'm going to title this layer a K as well, and I'm also going to make it red, color coding that. Now what I want to do is come back down here to my timeline. We're going to hit this button right here to create another cell or another frame to record this drawing information. Now again, if you've already watched the animation and video editing in Photoshop course, you'll have an understanding as to how these frames record visual information and how it correlates with the layers panel. Okay, so basically anything that you have visible, meaning that you've got this little eye right next to a layer, anything that you have visible is going to show up and be recorded on whatever frame that you have selected. Okay, so what we want to do is for this new frame, I want to have this previous frame that I worked on invisible. Okay, so on this frame here, there's nothing recorded on it, but if we go back to the first frame, you'll see the layers panel changes where that eye comes back up. On this first frame, it's recorded that eye right there. Okay, it's recorded the visibility. If we go to the next frame, we only have this new layer that we've created visible. Okay, so just it can kind of be a little bit confusing starting out, kind of getting used to this, but as we go further, you'll start to kind of gain a better sense of this correlation between the timeline and the layers panel. So before I draw this second pose in the same fashion, I actually do want to see the previous drawing, okay? So in this case, you actually would want to turn this I button on again for that first key storytelling pose. And on that layer, we'll go ahead and reduce the opacity a little bit more. Once we're done drawing our second pose, then we want to just make sure that we turn off the visibility again, just so it doesn't get recorded on that frame. Okay? All right. Now let's go ahead, we may want to zoom in just a little bit more here. And so I'm thinking about the character's figure starting to move towards the screen right. So making sure I have my new layer, my new key layer selected. We'll go ahead and we'll start with the head once again. So I think at this point, maybe the head has already kind of started to tilt a little bit, maybe even kind of tilting back. I'm kind of imagining her kind of moving her head kind of slightly, getting ready to tilt it back. And from there, I'm kind of visualizing her kind of turning her head towards the screen right, kind of in a rolling motion like this. And then she's going to whip it back again, whipping her hair around. So it's always good to kind of have some kind of idea in your mind as to the overall motion that you're wanting to animate. So maybe just spending some time thinking about it, where you want to go with it, maybe looking at some reference can always be very helpful. And then from there, you can begin to block in those thoughts. And that's what we're doing right now. So you can see how I'm kind of offsetting everything here just slightly. Again, I'm kind of imagining her body moving in that direction. We'll go ahead and bring that next pose down right there, that next drawing for her right arm. Again, it's going to be pretty much very similar. It's just that we've moved the body over. And again, keeping those fingers pretty minimalistic. So just drawing a stick figure once again. And this arm may kind of come out a little bit further. Again, I'm kind of visualizing her arm as kind of being a visual communicative device for this animation. She's kind of talking with the motion of her arm and her hand. So kind of maybe coming out something like that. So coming back to our layers panel, we have our second key storytelling pose drawn. And so I want to turn off the visibility of that previous layer. Again, I don't want it recorded on this frame. And we may have to do that on the previous frame as well. So on the previous frame, we want to turn off the visibility of that new layer that we created for the second frame. Again, this can be a little bit confusing, but as we move forward, hopefully you'll start to kind of become more acclimated with how this works. So just keep in mind the correlation. You just want to look at your frames and just be mindful of what you want recorded in accordance to what's visible over here in the layers panel. All right. Okay, great. So in our next lesson, we're going to pick right back up and we're going to draw our remaining key storytelling poses. Again, the key storytelling poses are poses that you can just look at them and have an idea or an understanding as to what is happening with your animation. So stick around and we'll go ahead and tackle that in our next lesson. In this lesson, we'll finish blocking in the key storytelling poses for our animation. So let's go ahead and dive back in. All right, so in the previous lesson, we began the process of blocking in the key storytelling poses for our animation. Again, these are poses that you can look at and just have an understanding as to the action that's taking place. So we're aiming for an animation of a slightly cartoon female character that's listening on her cell phone, and we're going to have some movement in her body. She's going to be kind of moving her arm and her hand, kind of making a gesture as if she's satisfied with what she's hearing on the phone. We'll also have her head kind of whip around and have her hair whip around as well as we later on begin to draw in volume. Now, as I mentioned in the previous lesson, we're keeping everything very minimalistic as we block in the character, meaning that we're just drawing stick figures right now, and I've got little marker points to kind of make note of where joints are in different areas and where just different facial features will fall as well. And so I'm doing this to really just capture the movement and positioning of our character before we get into drawing any kind of volume or detail. This is basically a roadmap that will allow us to work in those different details as we fill out the character later on. So just keep that in mind. And also keep in mind that this is just one process, one way of basically creating animation. It's kind of a layered process where we're starting off with the key drawings, we'll work in breakdowns and in-betweens later on. Okay, so we've got our first two poses right here. So she's starting to move her body, kind of swing that arm out a little bit. We got her head starting to turn a little bit as well. It's also going to be kind of turning slightly up at this point. And so it's going to turn up and kind of roll over towards the screen right, and then it's going to whip back over as she whips her hair around eventually. So let's go ahead and click on this button right here in our timeline panel to create a new frame. Now immediately you'll notice in that thumbnail, it's recording whatever is visible right now, whatever is visible in our layers panel. And again, this could take some time to get used to the correlation between the frame animation panel and the layers panel. But basically what I want to do is create a new layer in our layers panel. Again, I'm going to title this K. It's a key storytelling pose, so K for key. I am going to be color coding the different types of drawings that we create just so I can stay organized. It's a process that I find kind of helpful when working in Photoshop on an animation. Okay, so what I would like to do is lower the opacity of that previous drawing that I have on the previous layer. That way I can have an idea of the position of that previous key storytelling pose, and I kind of know where to draw the new one. Now before I do that, I want to go ahead and select the previous two drawings, okay, just by holding down Shift and clicking on both of them. You'll notice that when I do that, it's these two drawings right here show this new layer as being visible, and I'm not going to want that. I don't want the new drawing to show up as being recorded on those first two frames. So with those two selected, I'm going to turn off the visibility of that new layer that I created. So as I click on each one, that new layer is not visible, but it will be visible on the new frame that I created. And eventually I'll turn off the visibility of this drawing right here on this second layer for our new frame. So again, you'll kind of start to get a better sense of this as we move forward. Just kind of be mindful of what you want visible on your canvas and the relationship between these two. Okay, so grabbing my brush tool, I'm going to go ahead, and at this point I'm thinking she's already kind of turned her head. I'd like to start with the head, but you can really kind of start anywhere. If you like to kind of start with the overall spine line through the body, you can do that as well. But the head is a focal point with a character often. That's where a lot of emotion is conveyed, a lot of personality, and so our eyes tend to gravitate towards the head of a character, especially if it's a character of a person. So I like to kind of think about the head initially as I really sketch out a character, whether it's for animation or just an illustration. And again, I'm kind of dropping in a line for where I think the eyes will be, a kind of a center line right there, helping me kind of figure out where I want to also place the nose. And so these are good marker points that I can use. They'll be helpful for me later on as I begin working in detail and just adding a lot of volume to the character. And so I'm going to bring down this line right here. Basically, I'm thinking of that as basically the spine of the body. And so that's kind of where I can work the rest of the volume, rest of the body around it. And then I'm thinking she's probably going to drop her right arm just a little bit. She's kind of tilting her body, and so as a result of her kind of tilting her body, kind of tilting that head back, we may want to drop the shoulder as well and that arm. So just kind of thinking of the whole body all together. And as I mentioned in the previous lesson, it's good to kind of have a visual idea in your mind as to what you want to animate rather than just trying to make it up as you go. It might be a good idea to also look at some reference. Maybe you could go out and shoot some video of a friend or something like that and kind of study it and kind of scrub through it and figure out where those key storytelling poses are, and then just come in here in Photoshop and draw them like we are now. So really quick, for these first two poses, I'm kind of thinking that her hand over here on the screen right, basically her left hand, is going to be more kind of towards a side view to where you don't really see all the fingers. So kind of for those first two key storytelling poses, but by this point she may have rotated her hand. Okay, again, people kind of tend to talk with their hands sometimes, especially when they're on the phone. I know that I do that, so I'm kind of working in stuff like that. I think it adds a lot of personality into your animation, and that hand may be getting up there just a little bit high. So I'm just kind of thinking about where those fingers are right there. We may not see the thumb entirely right here at this point, just depending on how that hand is rotated around. So kind of something like that. And again, I'm kind of putting those little circles right there as guidelines, basically, to where I'll kind of know where to pull from as I begin to fill in those fingers. I kind of have a spot to kind of lead up to. And then thinking about the hand again over here that's holding the phone. Again, just keeping those fingers just lines, just real minimalistic. So at this point, she's kind of turned her head slightly as she's kind of turning it towards the screen right. And so I'm kind of feeling like maybe you'll see more of the backside or the top of her hand at this point. So just kind of scrubbing through here, jumping through these three poses, I'm kind of starting to get a better sense of what I have in my mind as far as the movement of this character. So right here we see more of kind of the side of the hand, where you see part of the kind of that fleshy part of the hand right here. Kind of seeing part of the palm of the hand for these first two. And at this point, her head's turned some more. She's starting to get ready to whip that hair around. We might see a little bit more of the back of the hand. So just little things like that you kind of want to think about. So that's looking pretty good. So I'm thinking we'll probably have one more key storytelling pose. So let's go ahead now and create a new layer, a new frame rather. So we'll click on this button right here in our frame animation timeline. And before we actually move any further, we'll jump back to that previous frame, and let's come over here to our layers panel and turn off the visibility of that previous drawing. Okay, so just kind of jumping through here, you can see all of those poses. You can see how the visibility changes in your layers panel. So on our new frame, it's obviously recording what we had visible. So I'm going to turn off the visibility of this layer right here. I'm going to lower the opacity of that most recent layer, the most recent drawing that we've created. And then I'm going to create a new layer. And again, I'm going to title it K. It's a key drawing. And I'm going to give it the same color. Okay, so now I'm ready to draw my final key storytelling pose. So I'm just going to come back over here to my canvas. I might zoom in just a little bit. And so at this point, she's already whipped her head around. She's already whipped her hair around over to this side right here, coming from this direction. So it's whipping around. So just visualizing that in my mind. And so now her head's going to be facing a little bit more back towards the viewer, but not tilted back as far. I'm thinking her head's going to kind of come down just a little bit. Just kind of putting a marker point right there for the nose and a cross line for where I want to kind of place those eyes. And thus far, the character's body has been going towards the screen right. So we can kind of get a sense of that. And again, this is another example of making sure you turn off the visibility for those previous layers that you do not want to have recorded of what's over here in the layers panel. So we'll just go ahead and select those 3 layers and turn off the visibility of that new layer that we have. So selecting those first 3 frames rather, turning off the visibility of that new layer that we have right there, and scrubbing through. So again, kind of being mindful of that. Just kind of be mindful of that as you go, as you make new layers, as you draw, because it can get really muddy really quick. Okay, so the body's been moving kind of towards the screen right. And so at this point, I may want to kind of have it shift back just slightly at this point, kind of at the very end. So if this is our last key storytelling pose, I want the body to have kind of settled, maybe kind of shifting back just a little bit, just so it doesn't come to a harsh stop. So also kind of thinking about the kind of positioning of the arms as well. I may have this arm kind of, this forearm right here, her left forearm kind of come in just a little bit. And at this point she may have kind of let her hand become more relaxed as it's kind of going limp, kind of coming outward just slightly. Again, kind of thinking about how she's talking with her hands. And then just bringing up those lines for the fingers once again. Okay, and now I'll go ahead and turn off the visibility of the drawing underneath, or the layer underneath, and we can start to get a sense of how this is looking. Now right now you could just click play, it's going to play insanely fast, and later on we can come in here and start to play around with the timing, how long we want to hold each one of these frames, or basically the exposure of each one of these frames. But we'll tackle that once we get in all of our blocking, all of our poses drawn in this fashion, basically kind of the stick figure fashion. We can kind of begin to think about the timing as well as far as holding each one of those drawings. All right, so in our next lesson, we're going to go ahead and begin sketching in, just as we have been, this time focusing on breakdown drawings. So stick around and we'll see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we'll begin sketching in the breakdown poses for our animation. So let's go ahead and get started. So we spent the last couple of lessons blocking in our key storytelling poses, just using very simple gestural forms. We're doing this because we don't want to worry about any kind of details just yet, which can really create a lot of confusion up front. And so rather, we're just focusing on the overall positioning and movement of our character. This also creates a roadmap for us to follow later on as we begin sketching in details and just overall volume for the character. But just kind of jumping through these poses again, we're able to gain a sense as to the action that's taking place just based off of these key storytelling poses. And so looking at them, I understand that this character is on their phone, just given the consistency of this hand right here against the head, and just how this other arm and hand is moving, and even how I've planned out the positioning of the head itself. So we're now ready to incorporate the guts of the animation, if you will, now that we have the entire framework laid out from the very first key pose to the last key pose. So with that said, we want to start with the breakdown poses, working those in between our key storytelling poses. So we'll jump to our first frame here, and so a breakdown pose is basically, well, it's an important transitional pose, if you will, that really allows us to visualize how we got from point A to point B, for example. So think of our first key storytelling pose as point A, our second key storytelling pose as point B. How did we get from this one to this one? So what we want to go ahead and do is with that first frame selected, I'll go ahead and click on this button here in my timeline panel and create a new frame that follows it. So you can see it selected right there. And obviously it's recording whatever we have currently visible right now in our layers panel, and we'll kind of rectify that here in a moment. So what we want to do is basically make sure, again, that we're keeping consistency relevant between our layers panel and our timeline panel. As you've already seen, as we add additional layers, they become stacked on one another. So just to recap really quickly, this layer right here that's at the bottom of the stack, that's our first key storytelling pose, which is that first frame right there. That next layer above it, that's our second key storytelling pose, which is now frame 3, because we've added a new frame right there after the first one, okay? And so on and so forth. So what I want to do is basically do the same thing with my layers panel. I want to go ahead and add in a new layer for my breakdown, which will be for that new frame that I added. So having done that, just by clicking on that button, I'll go ahead and rename that layer B for breakdown. And I want to keep everything kind of color coded. It just helps me differentiate between the different types of drawings that I've created. So we've got our layer for our breakdown. And so on this new frame, I'll begin drawing the breakdown pose on our breakdown layer. But what I want to do is kind of do what we've already done, which is a form of onion skinning. And that's where we were kind of reducing the opacity of drawings that either preceded or followed the current drawing that we're working on. And so I'm doing that now for this new layer that we're going to be working on for a breakdown. So just reducing the opacity of our first and second key storytelling drawings. So they're kind of ghosted out there, as you can see. Now making sure I have my breakdown layer selected and that we're on the correct frame, we'll begin drawing this key storytelling pose. And so at this point between these two storytelling poses, the head, which I like to start with, is rotating. And so I'm kind of thinking that a position in between those two poses where the head's kind of rotating and kind of starting to tilt back might be something kind of like this. So again, dropping in those markers that kind of allow me to see how the head is moving. They also provide me with nice guidelines for when I begin working in details later on in the course, such as where the eyes and the nose will go, the mouth, and so on. Also working down that spine line as well, just kind of thinking about how the body is moving kind of in that direction, kind of curving that way. And then just a position for the shoulder and eventually arm in between these two poses might look something kind of like this. So kind of have her slightly dropping down that right shoulder at first, and as a result that left shoulder will rise a little bit. If you recall, she's kind of starting to slightly tilts her head back this direction a little bit, and so that left shoulder is going to come upward. So just taking a couple steps back here by hitting Control Z. And again with the hands, just as I've done before, I'm not worrying about drawing nice, accurate fingers right now. I'm just thinking about putting down some little stick lines, thinking about the positioning of them. And I like to kind of put those little circles on the ends of each one of those, just so I can make note of where the fingertips will be. And again, she's kind of swinging that arm out the way I'm visualizing it. People tend to talk a lot with their hands and their arms when they're on the phone. So something kind of like that would be kind of a breakdown drawing in between those two key storytelling poses. Okay, excellent. I can go ahead and now turn off the visibility of those other two key storytelling poses so I can see the breakdown by itself on its respective new frame. And just as I've discussed in the last two lessons, we want to make sure that this new drawing is not visible on the other frames, because as you can see, if I go forward, it's getting recorded on those frames that follow it. So I want to go ahead on all the following frames, hold down Shift, and with one selected, I'll select all of them there, and then come over to my layers panel, turn off the visibility of that breakdown layer. Same thing with any preceding layers. And so now, and of course you want to make sure sometimes in doing so, it'll turn off the visibility for the frame you just worked on. But you can kind of see my process now. And you want to do this after each drawing, otherwise you can kind of have a very messy, muddy problem if you just kind of keep moving forward. So right now we have each drawing on their respective layer. And what I might want to do is, rather than just kind of click on each one of these individual drawings, I may want to select them all, just holding down Shift and clicking on the first one and then the last one. I'll go ahead and click on this little disclosure arrow right here, and we can choose a time to basically decide how long we want to delay each drawing. So I chose 0.5, so half a second. That's not what we're going to ultimately use. Once we have all of our drawings, we'll be able to decide an appropriate number for our animation. But just doing that, we can kind of slowly cycle through what we have right now. So I'm gaining a stronger sense of the overall movement of my character, and I'm really starting to feel it now. Let's go ahead and work in an additional breakdown drawing. I worked in, as you've already seen, one in between those first two key storytelling poses. So I'd like to work in one now between the second and third key storytelling poses. So just like I've done before, this time I'll go ahead and start with the layers panel. I'll create a layer for the second breakdown. And again, titling it and color coding it the same. And now I want to do the same thing over here, create its respective frame. So now I've created a frame that sits in between the second and third key storytelling pose. And just like before, we want to kind of do a form of onion skinning. So I'm taking down the visibility of the second and third key storytelling poses so that I can kind of faintly see them as I draw in my second breakdown. So before we begin just drawing outright again, let's go ahead and examine our animation again. So just kind of jumping through here. So kind of starting out, I have that right shoulder kind of come down slightly, okay? But then ultimately, that left shoulder is going to rise up a lot higher, just given how I'm planning to have her body kind of move in this direction, and the head is kind of tilting. We've got a little bit of compression, a little bit of compression just right here where she's got her right ear up against the phone. And so just kind of jumping through here, what I don't want is to have a completely linear transition with that left shoulder just moving upward. I may want to kind of have it dip down a little bit. So kind of in that fashion, kind of a swooping fashion, it'll just add to a more kind of fluid, elegant animation. So just kind of mentioning that, again, you want to really kind of visualize how your character moves, and you may want to act it out yourself or have a friend or even film it. So with that said, what I want to do is making sure that we are on our correct frame. Okay, so this is our new frame right here. I'm thinking that the head will look something like this. So at this point, the head's going to be tilting back. We're going to see less of the forehead. Kind of a transition in between the two. Marker for the nose. That spine right there in between those two drawings. Kind of curved as it moves towards the screen right. So we're going to have that shoulder kind of drop down before it goes back up. And just so bringing up that next drawing right there for the arm. That would be the right arm. And at this point, we're going to start kind of seeing the back of the hand on her right hand as it kind of starts to turn. So we won't see that thumb just yet, just in the way that I'm kind of visualizing it there. Okay, let's go ahead and turn off the visibility of those two key storytelling poses. Again, I don't want to have that recorded this breakdown recorded on the following drawings, and then same thing for the preceding ones. Alright, so that's starting to feel pretty nice. You can kind of see where I'm starting to go with this as I just kind of jump through these, and I'll go ahead and just click play. Alright, cool. So that arm will that shoulder will kind of dip down and then come up. That'll kind of add to a nice kind of swooping motion, especially if I'm planning to have her hair whip around, as I've mentioned before. So I'm going to have that arm right here, this forearm, kind of come upward before she kind of lets it go lax, and kind of that very talking kind of pose, that very hand talking pose, if you will, that we have right here for that last key storytelling pose. But already, just by adding these breakdowns, these transitional drawings, it's starting to help fill in a lot of missing information. It's starting to make our animation feel just a lot more clear. So in our next lesson, we'll go ahead and draw one more breakdown pose, and so that's going to sit in between our last two key storytelling poses, so 3 and 4. So that will be in between these two layers right here, as you can see. So stick around, and we're going to go ahead and tackle that in our next lesson. In this lesson, we'll sketch in one more breakdown pose for our character. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so in the last lesson, we worked in a couple of breakdown poses. And these are basically important transitional poses that allow us to dictate how we got from point A to point B. So in this case, we have our first key storytelling pose, and then our second key storytelling pose right here. And on this frame in between the two is our breakdown. So if we go ahead and just play that, we've started to fill in information, visual information, as to the action that our character is conveying. And so this brings us now to our last two key storytelling poses, where I feel like we could have a breakdown in between those two as well. And so this is towards the end of the animation. And so the character is going from this pose to this one right here. And so I feel like we could have something that really transitions in between the two. So this is after she's whipped her hair around and she's starting to settle into the last pose that we have right here. So just as we did before, I'll go ahead and incorporate, or place rather, a new frame in between those two. So just clicking on that button right there, adding a frame in between those two in our timeline panel. We want to do the same thing as we did in the previous lesson in our layers panel. So just adding a new layer in between those two key storytelling poses, those last two that we have right there. And I'll go ahead and color code it and rename it just as I did in the previous lesson. So these naming conventions and color coding really allow me to just stay very organized. Okay, so we want to go ahead now, and I'll reduce the opacity of that layer preceding the new breakdown layer, and then the layer that follows it, that last key storytelling pose, we'll go ahead and take its opacity down some as well, so that I can faintly see them as I draw in this new breakdown. This allows me to kind of decide where this breakdown will go. So just making sure that we're on our breakdown layer now, and we have the appropriate or its respective frame selected, we'll go ahead and begin to work in this breakdown pose. So again, starting with the head, it's an area I like to begin with. So kind of thinking about the eyes kind of falling in between those two eye lines right there. Bringing on that line. Nose will kind of fall in between those two as well. So I'm thinking about the head, basically, let me draw that a little bit more clearly, the head kind of rotating in that fashion, kind of back down, just slightly. Okay? Just taking a few steps back there. And then same thing with the spine line. At this point, the body's kind of settling to its final pose. Just kind of bringing up that arm kind of in between those two. And just as I've mentioned several times before with the fingers, I'm not worried about drawing perfect fingers. I just need those guidelines. Now with this this left arm, I'm going to have it come up because she's going to bring it up and then bring it down into that lax position for the final pose. And at this point, I'm visualizing seeing the whole back of her hand. So we will most likely see the thumb at that point. Something kind of like that. Okay, now to see this more clearly, what I've done here, I'll go ahead and turn off the visibility of those two ghosted layers. And again, if we move forward or backward, we're going to see that new breakdown automatically being recorded on other layers. So you want to make sure, just as we've done before, turn off the visibility for those other layers for that new breakdown. In this case, we have several preceding our new breakdown layers, so I want to click on the one right before it and then hold down Shift and click all the way on that first one there, getting all those, and then turning off the visibility of that new breakdown layer. So at this point, every drawing is on their respective frame. You can go ahead and kind of play through that there. We can see how that's looking. So you can see how I'm having her forearm come up and then she kind of brings it down. So I'm kind of trying to create the illusion that she's talking with that hand, that left hand, as most people tend to do when they're on the phone. Now again, as I've mentioned before, I'm picturing that left hand being more sideways to where you don't really see all the fingers starting out. So that is kind of why I have it looking like just a straight line right there with a little circle on the end, basically noting where the fingertip is. And then you can start to see how the hand begins to kind of turn to where you see more of the back of the hand. So we'll go ahead and play through that one more time. And so we've now added some more visual information for our character's animation, all the while keeping everything just very simple, just pretty much just drawing stick figures, just trying to capture the overall movement and position of our character and all of our character's different attributes. So now that we've got in some breakdowns, I'd like to now talk to you about working in in-betweens, starting in the next lesson. We'll spend a couple of lessons working in some in-betweens, and in-betweens are really just drawings to kind of help smooth out your animation, okay? And so we'll kind of go back through just as we've done with these breakdowns and pick out some areas where we might want to have an in-between, still drawing with just very simple gestural forms right here, again to really capture the overall movement of our character. So stick around and we'll tackle in-betweens starting in the next lesson.